Hi, welcome to FFRF's Ask an Atheist. I'm an attorney at FFRF. My name is Liz Cavell, and I'm here with Colin McNamara, another attorney. And today we are talking about the Irish referendum on Ireland's blasphemy provision. In the Irish Constitution, blasphemy is prohibited. It says the publication or utterance of blasphemous, seditious, or indecent matter is an offense which shall be punishable in accordance with the law. And on October 26th, Irish voters are being asked to vote whether or not to repeal this part of its constitution. So for Irish citizens, this was actually exacerbated in 2009 by a law that was meant to implement the constitutional language. It's a blasphemy law that defines the crime of blasphemy in relation to the number of people it offends, some unspecified number of touchy citizens. So the exact language is that blasphemous, in order for statements to be punishable as blasphemy, it has to be shown that they caused outrage among a substantial number of the adherents of that religion, the religion being blasphemed.
A ridiculously squishy standard, shall we say.
Yes, and it's never been enforced yet, so.
But we'd like to bring this topic actually back to the United States before we return to Ireland and discuss how actually here in the United States we've had these blasphemy laws on the books for centuries. They're rarely enforced nowadays because they do quite obviously violate the First Amendment. All the same, they are still around. They violate both the Establishment Clause and the Free Speech Clause. The Establishment Clause, this should be relatively apparent because it gives special protection to certain religions at the exclusion of other religions. They also violate the Free Speech Clause because they single out certain speech for punishment depending on its viewpoint. And the Supreme Court has been quite clear over the years that the one thing the government can't do is discriminate on the basis of viewpoint. So that might seem obvious to you, it's obvious to us, but it's hard to imagine a more glaring First Amendment violation than that. All the same, throughout our history in the United States, it hasn't always been that obvious to courts and to legislatures. These things have been around, they've been enforced, and they have a pretty interesting and at times funny and ludicrous history. They were routinely enforced in the 18th and 19th century, and they are on the books and enforced in the 21st century, believe it or not. The famed orator, attorney, skeptic, Robert G. Ingersoll, who I get my title from, famously defended C.B. Reynolds in his 1887 blasphemy trial in New Jersey. At the trial, Ingersoll famously quipped that blasphemy is what an old mistake says of a newly discovered truth. Reynolds was actually convicted in that trial, but Ingersoll paid his fine out of his pocket. And despite the conviction, after that, a lot of states were much more hesitant to attempt to indict people for blasphemy. Thankfully, the Supreme Court eventually took up this issue in 1952 in a case called Joseph Burston versus Wilson, and that case struck down the New York law against sacrilegious films because it violated the First Amendment, obviously. This was a unanimous decision. The Supreme Court came out very strong against blasphemy, saying that it is not the business of government in our nation to suppress real or imagined attacks upon a particular religious doctrine. So you'd think that would settle the issue, but even now, these laws have actually cropped up in the 21st century. In 2007, a man in Pennsylvania was denied the right to incorporate a company called Choose Hell Productions, LLC, because of the state's blasphemy law that forbid having names that were offensive to the particular Christian God. That did go up in federal court. It was struck down. That law is no longer enforceable, but it's still on the books. And Pennsylvania is not alone in this. There are actually 4 other states that still have blasphemy laws. I have a little sampling of some of them here. Here's Massachusetts. I'm not going to read the whole thing. It's long, but as you can see, it's very specific about which God they don't want you to blaspheme. It specifically says Jesus Christ, the Holy Ghost, yada, yada, yada. This law's actually been on the books in Massachusetts since the colonial era. This law was first passed in 1697, but it's still there. They've never taken it out. Beside Massachusetts, we have Michigan, who refuses to let you blaspheme the holy name of God and charges you with, at least it's just a misdemeanor, I suppose. Oklahoma is also very specific. You may not ridicule God, Jesus Christ, the Holy Ghost, the Holy Scriptures, or the Christian, or any other religion. South Carolina at least limits it. You may not use blasphemous, which is not defined, profane, or obscene language near a place of religious worship. So you just can't do it outside of a church. That's, at least it's a limiting circumstance.
Yeah, both unconstitutional and incredibly vague and unenforceable. As Colin mentioned, blasphemy is still on the books, even though it's unconstitutional and unenforceable. It's a criminal offense in 43 countries, actually, and it's a capital offense in 6 countries, meaning those people convicted of blasphemy can be sentenced to death, and are today in this day and age. They're still on the books in 1/3 of all the countries in the world, whether unenforceable or not. So we consider that a really big problem. In early 2015, to take it back to Ireland, on a show called The Meaning of Life in Britain, Stephen Fry answered the question of what would you say to God if you did meet him someday at the pearly gates? So listen to what he said.
I could watch that guy's reaction all day long.
Gay Byrne's face. I love that. Yeah, so a viewer reported this act of blasphemy to the Irish Gardaí, the police, as a violation of Ireland's blasphemy law. And a lot of publicity was generated around the fact that the Irish authorities actually investigated this act of blasphemy, obviously coming to the conclusion eventually that enough people, outraged citizens, couldn't be identified in sufficient quantities in order to prosecute, i.e. The blasphemy law was really just unenforceable the way it's written. But of course, this generated a lot of conversation and a lot of controversy around what it means, what values it reflects to have these laws on the books, and to even have a conversation about enforcing them against somebody voicing their opinion about God.
Especially someone as well-renowned and famous as Stephen Fry, just giving his honest opinion on a television show when asked a question.
Right.
It's bizarre to enforce in those circumstances.
So that was 2015, and Andrew Seidel, an attorney here at FFRF, wrote an op-ed recently for irishcentral.com, and it was basically in support of the referendum repealing the blasphemy provision of the Irish Constitution, and talking a lot about the Stephen Fry incident just as an example of why these laws are so antithetical to free thought and free speech. And it's funny because this summer, Andrew and I actually were in Ireland, and he sent a postcard from Ireland, Clonakilty, Ireland, which is a beautiful coastal Irish town. And this is the post office there, which is ironically in an old church, which has been converted, a beautiful old church, converted to a very practical secular use. It's the post office there in Clonakilty. And he sent this post office to FFRF. Greetings from Ireland. Blasphemy is illegal here, but there's still no God.
Lock him up.
Around his intentional act of blasphemy, he wrote this op-ed for irishcentral.com, basically arguing that the blasphemy constitutional provision is just so out of touch with both the Irish population and Western values, democratic values, that it should be overturned. And that, you know, these laws are ludicrously unenforceable, especially in free countries, non-theocratic countries.
Right. Yeah, it's bizarre, and it's funny. It's probably the easiest act of civil disobedience you could ever commit, huh? I mean,
Right.
so little effort required.
Yes, that was definitely not the only time he blasphemed while in
sure.
Ireland. However, it's the only one for which there's evidence.
Yeah, he put it in writing. That
Yeah.
was his mistake.
So just to talk a little bit more about Ireland, I mean, like many Western countries, and particularly Western European countries, it is a rapidly secularizing nation. Obviously very deep Catholic roots and traditions and a Catholic majority, but the population is rapidly becoming more and more secular,
Right.
identifying with no religion. I think they're up above 10%, which is high for
Ireland. Yeah.
For Ireland. And
They just repealed the Eighth Amendment.
Yep, they
That's a big
just repealed their abortion ban, which was another constitutional provision. And now all indications, I think, are that the blasphemy referendum will pass and it'll be removed from the Constitution. What you're reading here on screen is that over half of voters say they're going to vote in favor of repealing blasphemy from the Constitution. A stalwart 19% are polling as in favor of keeping blasphemy on the books. We're hoping this is on track to pass, and it'll just be another move towards secularizing, I think, Irish law along with its population.
It's been remarkable to watch, hasn't it? I mean, you say how rapidly they've been secularizing. Like, the Eighth Amendment repeal was just a few months ago.
Yeah, and I mean, that was an overwhelming kind of mandate that was repealed by a 2-to-1 margin, even though polling was close. So I hope this sends a similar signal in terms of just secular values. And, I think blasphemy is one that just goes to the heart of, what we would call sort of un-American values,
Sure.
But really anti-democratic values. Just the whole idea, and this was in Andrew's op-ed, of controlling what people say because it will offend other people.
Right.
Is really just that one kind of Orwellian step removed
Yes.
from controlling what people think and criminalizing what people think.
Yes. I guess if we wanted to be more cosmopolitan rather than un-American, we could say, it's sort of an anti-enlightenment kind of idea, right?
Totally.
This idea of the free transfer of ideas and nothing is above criticism and freedom of the tongue, freedom of the brain. And
right.
You're exactly right. It is a bit of an Orwellian nightmare. If you can control what people say, you can control what they think.
Right.
And this is a relic. Blasphemy laws like this are a relic of these are medieval. These have no place in modern society.
Right.
So.
And really, so many of them are actually indeed medieval.
Literally medieval. Yes.
They're held over from times when pre-Enlightenment times,
yes.
when Enlightenment values, didn't reign in Western societies as they do now. So a couple more examples that I wanted to talk about because they're close both in time and location. Earlier this year, and this touches on blasphemy in terms of the values that it seeks to enshrine. Earlier this year, FFRF was notified that a state senator, John Milkovich, and this is in Louisiana, along with 2 Baptist preachers, was urging the state of Louisiana, their Economic Development Office, to reject tax refunds to the AMC show Preacher, which I've never seen, but apparently contains, part of one episode at least, contained some graphic, in the words of these preachers and this hysterical state senator, pornographic. But I think graphic sexual scenes, and I don't know the plot of the show, but I think it involves like a Jesus Christ as a character engaging in a sexual scene that's graphic. The language is graphic. Anyway, the complaint was to the state of Louisiana, which gives tax incentives to productions that film in the state, which is not uncommon.
Sure.
Their letter said that they did not want to, quote, reward production companies that trash our Louisiana values, mock our beliefs, and dishonor Christ. And so FFRF obviously sent a letter to the state of Louisiana reminding them that they could not penalize, essentially amounts to a financial penalty to a private company for what they say.
Right. Viewpoint discrimination at its worst, right?
Right. And what they say that causes offense, especially explicitly religious offense. This was a clear kind of blasphemy problem in America, both the state of Louisiana being asked to both violate the free speech clause and the establishment clause of the First Amendment in withholding financial incentives that in all other ways were due to AMC. So
right.
That was really interesting, and that was earlier this year, 2018.
I think that's really interesting, though, as an example, because I just got done talking about all these blasphemy laws that are still on the books, but as they're written, they're obviously unenforceable. But what I think what this shows us, right, is that there are other ways to get there. You don't need a statute just saying it's illegal. You can refuse to give people money. You can withhold tax incentives.
I mean, so this is kind of anomalous, but
yeah.
right, this blasphemy laws traditionally have been criminal statutes
right.
Or constitutional provisions that envision criminal laws being passed to effectuate them. So, you know, saying if you blaspheme, it's a misdemeanor and you can go to jail for this long. But yeah, in this case, it was private citizens asking the state of Louisiana to basically withhold financial incentives from a company who offended their religious sensibilities.
And their Louisiana values.
And their Louisiana values. So that was really interesting. And, you know, I also want to just kind of bring up an example from a non-Western country that is also currently going on right now as we speak, because we're lucky. In a lot of ways, it's easy to forget, but we're lucky that we live in a country with the values that are enshrined in our First Amendment, that it is preposterous that a blasphemy law would be enforced or prosecuted here in the United States. But we mentioned that there are non-Western countries with these laws on the books that are punishable by death.
Yeah.
Pakistan is one of those places. And in Pakistan, actually, just last week, an appellate court, or I think the Pakistani Supreme Court, heard an appeal of Asia Bibi, who is a Christian woman. She's a Pakistani Christian. She was sentenced to death in a few years ago. 2014, I think. Death sentences are rarely carried out in blasphemy cases in Pakistan, but you can be sentenced to death there. She was for blasphemy that was reported by her Muslim co-workers, as she's a Christian. And even though it's rarely carried out, the sentences in Pakistan, it is routine for people accused of blasphemy and their lawyers and judges who sort of grant them reprieve to be victims of vigilante violence, including assassination. It's really scary. There's great concern over Bibi's safety as she's being held in prison, and her appeal is going up right now. So Pakistan's Supreme Court heard her appeal last week, and the Supreme Court justices are receiving death threats. In case they might grant her clemency. And so this is actually, you know, it's sort of lighthearted when we're thinking about it in terms of the US, but there definitely are places in the world where blasphemy is not only considered an enforceable crime, but it's punishable by death. And the public is just absolutely crazed and violent over the idea that there are people who would blaspheme against their religious sensibilities or what their religious beliefs are.
Right.
I mean, Charlie Hebdo,
yes.
violence. I mean, we've seen the, fatwa violence against people, Salman Rushdie, who will be at our convention,
you can see at our convention, yes.
next month. But seriously, I mean, this is no laughing matter.
No,
Salman Rushdie
stakes.
doesn't go anywhere without, probably a full guard detail. And I mean, this is just a really frightening reality in a lot of parts of the country. And it just kind of shows how oppressive and it just shows what these laws embody and what they project to the public.
It's a very ugly side of us, isn't it? And I think it goes to your point, though. It shows the insidious effect of these laws, that something about having them there, having laws in place where the state is sanctioning imprisoning or fining or even killing people because they say something wrong about some made-up figure, emboldens the public. I mean, it makes them in tune, that it makes their belief even more strong and more violent,
right,
and willing to carry out the state's justice on their own if the state won't do it themselves.
Yeah.
I mean, that's very insidious.
It is, and it's frightening. And yeah, there are hardline Muslim groups in Pakistan routinely carry out, vigilante violence against people accused of blasphemy, and people that represent people accused of blasphemy. They've also asked Pakistani authorities to put this woman, Asia Bibi, on a no-fly list so that if she is released, she can't seek political asylum somewhere else. So it's really horrifying, and not all lighthearted, unenforceable nonsense
right.
throughout the world. So I forgot to mention in the beginning, sorry, please, if you have any questions about this topic that you'd like us to address, just type them in, comment on Facebook. You can also email askanatheist@ffrf.org. And I'm going to check out any of today's questions.
Hopefully some of you out there are familiar enough with how we do this that we already have some questions.
Yeah, so here we have a question from Amber Gwynn. This is interesting. The question is, can the U.S. justify blasphemy laws by calling blaspheming comments hate speech?
You want the short answer or the long answer?
First, the short.
No. I would advise anyone, I understand it's an interesting, we toss around nowadays the phrase hate speech as if it is a category of speech in law, and it's not. It doesn't have any special protection or punishment under the First Amendment. It's a term that we use all the time in popular commentary and in conversation, but the Supreme Court has never identified a category of speech that it calls hate speech. There's an excellent book on this I'd recommend highly. It's called Hate by Nadine Strossen, who's the former head of the ACLU. Who just came out, I think this book just came out a couple months ago. But it's entirely on about why the idea of hate speech laws are incompatible with the First Amendment. Mm-hmm. And so, no, I mean, those laws would be struck down under the First Amendment if they existed. Especially
if they only regulated speech. There are certainly hate crime statutes.
Yes.
And I think reasonable legal minds can and have argued about whether or not hate crime statutes raise First Amendment issues and are constitutional. But in terms of just justifying a blasphemy law under a narrower category or some definition of just hate speech and criminalizing speech that's hateful, I think that would be viewed pretty universally as incompatible with our First Amendment.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay. We've got one more question. I wish this were a joke, but I don't think it is. Tanis Martlin, do you think the Religious Liberty Task Force could try to force more of these laws into our state constitutions? So for those of you not familiar with the Religious Liberty Task Force, that is a task force that has been put in place by Attorney General Jeff Sessions to do who knows
something?
Something with religious liberty. And so there's been a lot of concern that it is sort of some sort of anti-LGBT.
Yeah. I mean, no one really knows, right?
Yeah.
I mean, at best, it's probably just grandstanding, and it's ineffectual and pointless.
Yeah.
At worst, it will be used to allow people to weaponize free exercise and get away with discriminating against people on the basis of their beliefs. Right.
I think mostly it will sort of take those turns, exempting people, exempting religionists and probably mostly Christians from secular laws that conflict with their religious beliefs. So, things like pharmacists that don't want to fill prescriptions, birth control prescriptions, and doctors that don't want to perform.
And we can't talk enough about cake makers.
Yeah, right. Private business owners that don't want to serve LGBT customers, things like that. I think that is what's being whipped up that the Religious Liberty Task Force is responding to by being created. It's not clear what their directive is and what they'll actually do. I don't think they would really have the power to get state constitutional language changed or inserted. That's still, thankfully, not a quick or easy process by any means. And blasphemy, I mean, I think, I mean, times are changing, but blasphemy is definitely recognized as a pure regulation on speech, unpopular speech, which is just so antithetical, at least to American constitutional values, that it would be hard to imagine an actual resurgence of blasphemy, support for blasphemy laws in our country, thankfully.
Let me just say, I think, one, I'm annoyed by the Religious Liberty Task Force because, for my money, we're the Religious Liberty Task Force, thank you kindly.
I know.
But also, no, they don't really have, this is just a bunch of folks at the DOJ, right? They don't really have the authority to go in and tell state legislatures what to do. And even if, I mean, if the question is also that, like, having someone around like the Religious Liberty Task Force would create kind of a climate where maybe more state legislatures want to do that, that's possible. But as you mentioned, blasphemy laws hit on religious freedom, and they also hit on free speech. And if there's one thing our Supreme Court has always been pretty good at, it's free speech. They're hardliners on it nowadays. So some would say to a fault sometimes. So I doubt that they would allow those laws to exist for very long if they were ever passed.
Yes, one bright spot, I think.
Yeah.
Although...
Find your optimism where you can.
Right. So there's no more questions on this topic, but I just wanted to mention, if you're not already getting our action alerts and you want to hear about issues threatening state church separation in your area, please join our action alerts by texting FFRF to the number 52886. That's FFRF to 52886. And that will enroll you in our action alerts via text, and you can easily hear about and take action against threats to secularism in your area. Thank you so much for joining us this week at Ask an Atheist. Join FFRF next week, same time, same place, for Ask an Atheist.